On the 27th of April, 2025, the Central Methodist Mission, alongside the District 6 Museum, hosted a special Freedom Day service and discussion to retrace their history in what was once the Buitenkant Street Methodist Church. Many congregation members, with deep roots in the church and in District 6, gathered to reminisce about the time they spent in Buitenkant Street before it amalgamated with the Metropolitan Methodist Church in Greenmarket Square in 1988. Using interviews and recordings of a panel discussion, this podcast will explore what it meant for people to worship at the Buitenkant Street Church and how the move to Metropolitan affected them. First, we listen to Bishop Peter's story as he describes what life was like during that time.
I remember standing in this pulpit for the first time, and of course everybody had come to see the new minister. So all 800 seats in this place were packed. And here was this white guy standing in the pulpit and his white wife and their two little white kids. And it was just months after District 6 had been declared a white group area. And so the years that I spent here were years in which people were trying to come to terms with the fact that their home and the homes of their ancestors were going to vanish under bulldozers because of the stroke of a pen in some government office, and because of the terrible fear that some people in this land had of being with people who were different and discovering they were the same. And so it was a case of ministering to the beginning of a trauma which I know still scars many of your lives.
Bishop Peter's story arrived at the Buitenkant Street Methodist Church in 1966. The same year, District 6 was declared a white group area. The following year, in 1967, forced removals had already begun and the demolition of people's homes followed soon after. Over the years, the residents of District 6, and naturally the Buitenkant Street congregation, dwindled as people were forced to move to the Cape Flats on the outskirts of Cape Town. Now, people had to travel to the inner city if they wanted to attend service at the Buitenkant Street Church. And because most people were unable to afford the cost of transportation, by 1983, the congregation decreased from 800 people to just over 200. By the late 1980s, this number was even smaller, and in 1988 it was decided that the Buitenkant Street congregation would amalgamate with the Metropolitan Methodist Church adjacent to Greenmarket Square. Together, these two congregations formed the Central Methodist Mission. When the congregation entered the museum for the special Freedom Day service, one could sense the vibrancy and enthusiasm in the building as they greeted and hugged one another. Let's listen to Brian Heuwel and his wife, Pat Lawrence, as they reflect on the time they spent at the Buitenkant Street Church.
Well, I grew up in Buitenkant Street. I attended the Sunday school there that you probably heard that Jane Lawrence started, or not started, but held. And then from there was, previous to that I was baptized, then confirmation, and then attended youth club, CLC, Carpenter's House, attended the church, and then left for a while. And that was the time with the political unrest and the forced removals. My parents were part of the forced removals from District 6. They lived in Sterling Street, very close to, between Trafalgar High and Trafalgar Junior. So yes, that was my journey.
Brian Heuwel was born into the Buitenkant Street Church. He was baptized in the church attended Sunday school and confirmation classes, and spent his formative years taking part in the church's various ministries. In later years, after returning to the church, he met his wife, Pat Lawrence, and she too recognized the great influence the church had on her life.
Buitenkant Street gives me, as I look back on my history in my older years or latter years, I look back and am able to identify Buitenkant Street as the space and the place where I formed my opinions, where I formed my identity, and which gave me my culture. And before forced removals, like I was saying earlier on, everybody was an aunt and uncle. It was a community. It was an incredibly strong community. As Brian would attest to, everybody in District 6 worshipped at Buitenkant Street. And you knew everybody, and everybody knew you. And if you grew up there, then obviously everybody knew your name. So it was a very special place, but it was also a place where I forged my political opinions, where I forged my political persuasions through the various ministers that we had, following on from Peter, who really set the benchmark for the kinds of activities, the kinds of engagements, the kind of space Buitenkant Street was to all of us, to the extent when we had the Purple Dye March and we had to run from the special branch and the tags. Where did we run to? We ran to Buitenkant Street, and the doors were locked because the security branch and the police could not enter the church. Bear in mind, this was opposite Caledon Square. And that was for all of us, because that was our safe space. That was the space we knew, and that was the space we ran to.
The Buitenkant Street Church was not only a place of worship for Pat Lawrence, it was a haven, a place you could go to in times of trouble. Jane Lawrence, who at the time was the pastoral assistant to Bishop Peter Storey and a Sunday school teacher, remembers how the church and its ministers instilled in her the confidence to speak up during difficult times and the tools and leadership skills to help others do the same.
The political thing developed through all the opportunities we were given to talk. I think that was the most important thing within the life of this community, because the way we were treated, our leadership skills certainly were not developed. But working here, I was convicted by, I will never be afraid. I have to speak up. This anger that God gives us is this righteous anger that says, speak up. But speak up in an assertive way, always, and a respectful way. And that's how I've lived my life. And I want to say thank you to the courage that we were given to understand our theology and what it means to be an active citizen in the world, bringing about a shared humanity, and not to be embarrassed about speaking about politics or standing up. So there are lots and lots of the opportunities that we had here to witness to the example and the ministry of Jesus Christ that was brought about through our ministers. The hardest one was going to Metropolitan.
Jane Lawrence speaks passionately about the role the church played in her life, and not only in terms of her spiritual growth, but also in terms of her political awakening and activism. For Jane, and I'm sure for many others, the church was a spiritual home, but it was also a political home. This is why, in the late 1980s, when talks of the amalgamation started gaining traction, they resisted. They did not want to leave.
In this place, we had many, many meetings where our people, the seniors in our congregation, were fiercely fiercely defensive about wanting to give up this church again. We've given up so many things, they say. So many things we've given up. Why do we have to do it? But we believed, because of the political resistance and the struggle that we were going through from 1976, before 1960, but the 1976 imposition of Afrikaans, the tricameral system that was imposed upon us, the 1980 resistance that we had, the sanctions and the boycotts, all different ways that we would, the role of the UDF, also the United Democratic Front, gave us voices to understand what was going on. Steve Biko's philosophy of teaching us to understand who we were as our sense of identity. Be what God wants you to be. You don't have to be inferior to anybody. Neither do you have to exert power over anybody else either. That was his philosophy. And I tried to understand, I'm always talking to God all the time. Now I thought, why are these people looking at us like this? And I'd say, maybe they're elderly people and they are so frightened. But they were grateful. They didn't want to shake our hands. They gave us no welcome. They left, they fled week after week. It was too painful, but we continued because we believed this was going to be a community where everybody would be included, where no language, no accent would be ridiculed, but all would be accepted and included. It was Peter said, when you invite Jesus into your heart, everybody comes in, and that's what you have to do. And that's what I've been trying to do. But it seems to be very hard and very painful.
When Jane Lawrence spoke about the 1988 amalgamation with the Metropolitan Methodist Church, we can hear the congregation murmur in agreement as she spoke about how hard it was for them to let go of Buitenkant Street and the cold reception they received when they made the shift to Metropolitan. This sentiment was echoed by Brian Heuwel and Pat Lawrence.
I think it was a very sad period for people. There's a lot of people that had to deal with a tumultuous time in their lives in order for that decision to be made. But the church, I think the church provided the strength and the comfort for people to continue and to worship, to come and worship.
One of the things we had to do was to break down those barriers, those false barriers that were created within the circuits. And so Methodism and created that as was the law of the land. So with Buitenkant Street, we had Salt River as part of the circuit, and then we had Kingsington. But in between, there was Woodstock, which was a white church, so they belonged to another circuit. And so the commitment of the people of Buitenkant Street, as with others, was to break down the barriers that we could within the church. And those barriers had to go. And so before we could get to the walk across, it was the whole process of ensuring that those barriers were broken down in terms of geographical circuits. As you know, geography was everything under apartheid. So those things had to be broken down. The thing for me that stands out most in my memory of coming here was how white people fled. They fled to Sea Point. They just got out. When we came here, there was a whole lot of people, and they looked at us, and the following week there were less white people, and the following week there was less white people, and that just continued. But to understand how even at that stage of our lives, white people still would not deal or confront a engagement with other people across colour lines. And so that was the harsh reality of coming across. Making this our own and embracing the broader community was something that we then had to build up from scratch to make this an open and welcome space for everyone.
While Jane Lawrence, Pat Lawrence, and Brian Heuwel spoke about how hard it was for them to make the shift to the Metropolitan Methodist Church, Margaret Rundle, the wife of Reverend Alistair Rundle, who ministered at Metropolitan, could speak to how their congregation responded to the amalgamation.
I'm Margaret Rundle. My husband was the minister at this church and superintendent at Buitenkant Street, so we were here in a very much crossover period, but just before the amalgamation. And so he worked through all the negotiations and that sort of thing. And it was a hard time. It was, there were just so many feelings and so many preconceived ideas, and it was very much an us and them situation at that stage. It was a sad setup in many ways. We were very aware here of what Buitenkant people were, how hard it was for them, and some of the old people said, I can't. We were thrown out and I cannot come back. And I think one in particular I don't know that she ever did come here at all. So there was all that going on. But from this congregation's side also, a fairly small, mostly elderly congregation, so it was struggling, and I think David said, it would have collapsed probably. But it was hard that those that had been here through the 5 years of my husband's ministry hadn't heard the message and were just not ready for it, and to their loss, And so there were very few real faithful people who stayed with the amalgamated church, but it was almost Buitenkant Street with a few Metro members who were still around, and then gradually as it developed, then more people came in from outside. But it was a hard time, and I'm just very grateful to the Buitenkant Street people who accepted us for what we were.
After the amalgamation, Reverend David Newby was appointed as minister of what became the Central Methodist Mission. And as minister, he took on the role of firstly, guiding both congregations to becoming one, and secondly, of fostering a space of resistance that was so prevalent in the Buitenkant Street Methodist Church.
Yeah, and I remember it was, I arrived in end of 89, beginning of 1990. But I learned, I think, with Peter and before about standing up. We were tested very soon. February 2nd, 1990, I'd been here for 1 month, and 25,000 people gathered outside Market Street Church. And we were going to march to Parliament to call for a People's Parliament. At the end of the meeting, the rally on the parade, the ANC said they needed it, they wanted to have a conference, a press conference. We went back to the Metropolitan Hall, and for the first time, that place of white privilege hosted the first ANC press conference ever to take place. It took place in the Metropolitan Hall. But for me, that symbolized what happened. And what happened to me is that we continue to speak truth to power. And that happened in this building for years and years. This was the place when people were arrested. The families came to this building, and this is where they received counseling and support, and money was gathered to get paid bail. All happened in this building. It was Cadogan Square across the road. But what I loved about what happened is that Market Square also became the site of struggle. And so Mandela spoke there in 1991. Thabo Mbeki spoke there. The Nationalist Party was going to give themselves the right to pardon themselves for apartheid crimes. That amnesty they wanted to do. And we marched to Parliament and from Market Square, not from Buitenkant Street as we always used to say, you cannot do this. But that for me is what happened because Buitenkant Street, they redeemed that place. That is now our place.
So the members of the Buitenkant Street Methodist Church settled into their new home. And as we heard from Reverend David Newby, they took the spirit of Buitenkant Street with them, transforming the Central Methodist Mission into a site of struggle, a place of resistance against the apartheid government. But they still had to decide what was to become of the church in Buitenkant Street. How did it become the District 6 Museum? Reverend David Newby can shed some light.
We're still having services in Buitenkant Street. I don't know if you remember that. But there was an evening service here, and I used to come and preach here on a Sunday evening. There would be about 8 or 10 people. Eventually, we realized it wasn't really sustainable. And it was a lot. There was a preacher, there was an organist, and there were 7 or 8 people sitting in the pews. But it was a lovely time of fellowship, and we held on to the space. But then we as a congregation started talking about we must be good stewards of what we have. And we had a referendum. And I don't know how many of you remember the referendum? We had a referendum, and we asked all of the congregation whether they would be open to it becoming a community centre, a place that would host. It was already hosting Ormsplek and Stepping Stones, and we said that the sanctuary should be a place that also is a community centre. And I can't recall the number of respondents. It was more than 100, which was a lot at that time. And I think it was something like over 90% of the people said, yes, we want Buitenkant Street to be a community centre, a place that will continue to minister. And that coincided with Stan and Ruth and Crane and saying we want a museum. That's what Terence Hendricks, people like that. We want to have a museum. And so we said, yes, let's do that. I went overseas and I managed to raise some money, and we got some money for an exhibition. It was called the Streets Exhibition because they found someone who had kept all of the street signs and District 6, and they said, we'll have an exhibition with the street signs and some other things. And so those who don't remember, we left the pews in the middle. So where you're sitting now, we left the pews. We took all the pews out along the side, and the exhibition went in. And we said it will run for 10 days. Well, I don't remember how much longer, but certainly a few years later, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people had come through these doors to see what had happened. And eventually we took out the other pews, the mat went in, and many, many other exhibitions came in. And Buitenkant Street then continued to perform its ministry. And I'll share one story because, you know, there's loss. Obviously, there's loss leaving here. But we will never know how many lives were touched by people who walked through these doors after the act of faith of saying, let's make the journey over there and let's turn this into a place that will be a community centre. And when it became a museum, I remember Sandra Prosidendis, who was the director, saying to me the other day, I found 2 people on the mat standing over one of these blocks. A Jewish man and a Muslim woman. And they hugged each other. And they discovered that they had lived in the same house at different times. And they shared their story with each other. And I said, how many programs has the church tried to run to bring people together? And yet here, through this act of letting go, ministry just continued. That's why I'm so proud that this place still stands and will continue to stand because of an amazing relationship that was built over the years.
So the Metropolitan Methodist Church became the Central Methodist Mission. And thanks to people like Stan Abrams, Terence Fredericks, Crane Sudeen, Ruth Cooks and others, the Buitenkant Street Methodist Church became the District 6 Museum. And while both institutions were born out of a very painful period for the members of Buitenkant Street, 37 years later, they continue to thrive, they continue to build and grow, And today, these institutions serve not only as reminders of the hardship people experienced, but also as manifestations of their faith and resilience. You're listening to another episode of the District 6 Museum Vusalela Ons Luister podcast series, a series filled with stories from our multifaceted sound archive, from interviews to recordings of events and panel discussions. And if you would like to hear more stories about life in District 6, we encourage you to visit the District 6 Museum. I'm Lisa Hendricks, and thank you for listening. No matter where we are here.